So I should really, before I start, I should really say that I'm not going to be directly engaging with the main question. So I edit the subtitle, and the subtitle really captures what I'll be doing, because I think it's just really hard to define what phenomenal realism is. And in a way, I think Keith is a phenomenal realist. Okay, right. So existing experimental data on the hard problem of consciousness suggests that lay people, non-philosophers, lacked the concept of phenomenal consciousness and lack a number of problem intuitions with respect to the hard problem associated with the hard problem. So on the face of it, this existing literature seems to be quite problematic for a certain dominant way of theorizing, armchair theorizing about consciousness and the heart problem. So in my talk, I'm going to take a critical look at this experimental literature. Okay, here's the plan for the talk. So first, I'll give a brief survey of some key studies on this topic, and then I'm going to look at some alleged implications from existing literature. So the main bulk of the talk, I'll be offering a critique of a general critique of the experimental literature on the heart problem, and then there will be a short conclusion section as well. Okay, so with respect to X5 on the heart problem, there are two strands of discussions. So one strand is concerned with this question whether lay people have the concept of phenomenal consciousness, and the second strand is concerned with the question whether lay people have so-called problem intuitions about phenomenal consciousness. So I'm going to talk about some key studies with respect to each research question. Okay, so do lay people have the concept of phenomenal consciousness? So in an early paper by Sitzman and Mashri, so they're concerned with this question. They think that if lay people have the concept of phenomenal consciousness, this concept would manifest in their attributions of phenomenal states, especially paradigmatic phenomenal states like feeling pain and seeing red. And in particular, they think that lay people would, if they have the concept, they would attribute these states in a similar way to philosophers. Okay, so their experiment involves a very simple scenario. The scenario involves an agent manipulating a red object, and the agent comes in two conditions: a robot, a simple robot, and a human. Okay, so I think the agent gets electric shock if they fail to lift the red object, and they ask participants, philosophers and non-philosophers, whether the agent saw red and felt pain. Okay, and what they found was that philosophers treated these mental states in a similar way. They attributed both to the human subject and attributed neither to the robot, whereas non-philosophers treated these two states very differently. I think non-philosophers, they attributed seeing red to the robot, but not feeling pain, and they attributed both to the human. Now, they draw the conclusion that lay people fail to track phenomenality of mental states, paradigmatic phenomenal states like seeing red and feeling pain. And then they conclude that non-philosophers lack the concept of phenomenal consciousness. Okay. Now, a number of critics raised this worry that this phrase "see red" is potentially ambiguous. There's at least a non-phenomenal reading, "see red," which we can reasonably attribute to simple robots. Okay. Now, in a later revised design by Sitzman and Ostermeer, they replaced the phrase "see red" and the phrase "feel pain" with "experience red" and "experience pain" to avoid this ambiguity objection. But what they found, results nevertheless showed a similar pattern, though to a lesser extent. Lay people again attributed experiencing red to the robot, but not experiencing pain, while they attributed both to the human, whereas philosophers attributed both to the human, neither to the robot. Okay, again, the conclusion they draw is that lay people lack the concept of phenomenal consciousness because they fail to track phenomenality in these paradigmatic mental states, phenomenal states. So in a recent corpus study by Sitzman and Fisher, they looked at ordinary uses of the word experience, the English word experience. So philosophers of mind who work on the heart problem consciousness tend to think that the notion of phenomenal consciousness is lexicalized, and the word experience is usually thought to be its lexicalization. So we talk about the experience of seeing something red, the experience of feeling pain, where experience is used to denote the phenomenal character or the phenomenal property of these experiences. Okay. Now, what they found was that outside philosophy of mind, so not just, it's only outside philosophy of mind that the word experience is seldom used to refer to phenomenal states. So, okay. And then they draw the conclusion that it is doubtful that lay people have the concept of phenomenal consciousness. The best candidate experience doesn't capture the notion of phenomenal consciousness. Okay. So moving on to the second strand of discussion on the heart problem, on the X5 heart problem. So this is the question whether lay people have problem intuitions. Okay. Now, problem intuitions come in all sorts of different kinds. There are knowledge intuitions, explanatory intuitions, metaphysical intuitions, modal intuitions. Now I'm going to assume that people are familiar with these intuitions, and these problem intuitions serve as the first premises in corresponding anti-physicalist arguments. Okay. Now, do lay people have these intuitions? Well, existing data suggests a sort of a mixed picture. So I'm going to talk about some key studies with respect to each kind of problem intuitions. In a recent study by Gregory et al., they tested sort of Jackson's Mary intuition, but their scenario is a modified version. So in their scenario, Mary, again, is a super scientist who knows all there is to know about color perception, but Mary is colorblind. And in their scenario, there is an operation available, and Mary can have this operation and have color perception. Okay. Now they tested people's lay people's knowledge intuitions in two conditions. One is a pre-operation condition, and the other one is post-operation condition. So in the pre-operation condition, they asked participants whether Mary knows what it's like to see red before the operation, and about 82% of participants answered no. And in the post-operation condition, they asked the 82% participants whether Mary would learn what it's like to see red when she sees a red tomato after operation. And out of the 82%, a bit over 90 respondents answered yes. So this is fairly good evidence that lay people have the knowledge intuition. Okay, now with respect to explanatory intuition, Diaz in a recent paper sort of run several tests on this. So in his design, he provided a vignette outlining the close connections between the feeling of pain and neural activity in this area, the DPI, the dorsal posterior eye region of the insula. So it's a quite detailed vignette. And at the end of the vignette, he asks participants, again, non-philosophers, to rate this statement. The properties of pain are fully explained in terms of neural activity in the DPI. And what he found was that a majority of participants actually agreed with this statement. So he concludes that explanatory intuition is not widespread. Now, with respect to metaphysical intuitions, Diaz, in the same experiments, he tested metaphysical intuitions as well. So with the metaphysical intuition, he used this statement, for instance, the feeling of pain is just neural activity of the DPI. Again, what he found was that dualistic intuition is not widespread. Participants, majority of them agreed with this statement. Okay, moving on to modal intuitions. So in the early paper by Parasini, so he directly asked non-philosophers whether the following kind of scenarios are possible. One is a medical procedure that would remove your inner experience without affecting your brain, so that so from the outside you would remain unchanged physically. Did you want to record, by the way? I know it's like oh, sorry. Okay, okay. So from the outside, it just occurred to me. Sorry. So from the outside, you would remain unchanged physically and behaviorally. Okay. And the second scenario, a person physically and behaviorally identical to you in all ways, but who had no inner experience at all. So he asked participants whether these scenarios are possible. And what he found was that a majority of the participants did not judge these scenarios to be possible. So this is concern that whether participants have latched onto the intended notion of possibility. So I'll come back to this idea later. Okay, in a recent study by Fisher and Sitzma, so they studied lay people's zombie intuitions or conceivability intuitions. So the results were quite interesting. So they find framing effects with respect to people's zombie intuition. So philosophical zombies are physical duplicates of us, but lack consciousness. So what they found is that when you phrase the notion phenomenal zombie in using the word zombie, participants tend to have conceivability intuition, but when you phrase it in terms of duplicate, using the word duplicate, majority of the participants didn't have zombie intuitions, philosophical zombie intuitions. So there is a sort of linguistic salience bias contributed to the conceivability of philosophical zombies. Okay. Right, so I'm gonna move on to the second section. This is about alleged, so experimental philosophers tend to draw implications from their existing data. So I have two kinds of inferences in mind. So this is on your handout as well, 1 and 2, and I'll keep coming back to these two inferences. The first inference is from, they tend to draw is that lay people do not have philosophers' concept of phenomenal consciousness. So this is with respect to the first strand of discussion, X5 literature. And the second inference they tend to draw is that lay people do not have the relevant popular intuition. So this is with respect to the second strand of the literature. But the second inference doesn't apply to all studies. So, but as we saw, apart from the knowledge intuitions, existing data seem to suggest that non-philosophers lack explanatory, metaphysical, and modal intuition. So I'm going to focus on these two inferences from existing data. Now, 1 and 2 then get used to draw further implications with respect to mainstream theorizing about the hard problem. So I'm going to look at 4 further implications. Okay. Now, 1 has been used to question the idea that the existence of a phenomenal consciousness seems obvious, right? This is a claim that even radical illusionists can agree to. So you can understand obviousness as an epistemic claim, and you can think this epistemic claim is grounded in some kind of introspective evidence. Right. So how might one problematize the obviousness? So experimental philosophers seem to rely on this kind of conditional, this principle. If the existence of phenomenal consciousness seems obvious, then we would expect lay people to have the concept of phenomenal consciousness. And with respect to the consequence of this conditional, so if lay people have the concept of phenomenal consciousness, then this concept would either manifest in how people utilize and apply the concept, or this concept will be encoded by an ordinary English word like the word experience, but neither seems to be the case from existing empirical literature. So given the conditional, obviousness is in question. Okay. Now, 2 has been used to support anti-physicalist arguments. So think about the zombie intuition, right? So Fisher and Sitzma conclude that lay people lack zombie intuition, and then they then argue that the zombie argument can't get off the ground. Now there's this issue about whether in philosophical theorizing we should care about non-philosophers' intuitions. Some philosophers think that only philosophers' intuitions matter here. So this is a substantive issue, and I'm going to set it aside. But at least on the face of it, I think physicalists can appeal to this existing data to defend physicalism by rejecting the first premise, the intuition premise of anti-physicalist argument. Okay. Now, either 1 or 2 has been used to question the existence of the hard problem itself. Okay. So here's a quote from Sitzman and Mashri in their 2010 paper. So they were concerned with this question whether lay people have the concept of phenomenal consciousness, and this is what they say. It is important to ask why we should believe that there is really a hard problem in consciousness. That is, why should we believe that there are experiences as defined such that an aspect of them is expected to be left unexplained even after we have thoroughly accounted for their functional roles? But then you might think, well, whether the hard problem can can be motivated or not doesn't really depend on whether lay people have the concept of phenomenal consciousness. Maybe all it matters is that they can latch onto the concept when they get introduced to this concept. So Sitzman and Mashri are very aware of this concern, and then they say this. We concede that if people could easily be taught to recognize the phenomenality of a mental state, such as seeing red and feeling pain, then the worry we have been raising would be alleviated. However, it is unclear whether the antecedent of this conditional is true, and they cite personal anecdotes. In our experience, many ordinary people either don't understand or don't take seriously the philosophical concept of phenomenal consciousness, even after a lengthy explanation. Okay, now the combination of 1 and 2 have been sort of, experimental philosophers don't make this explicit, but in my reading, I think the combination of 1 and 2 have been used to support a certain kind of illusionism. So on this version of illusionism, phenomenal consciousness, which is the subjective phenomenon that seems non-physical, hard to explain, etc., is merely a theoretical construct, which is elusive to lay people. Okay, so I should note that illusionism comes in different varieties. Strong illusionists deny the existence of a phenomenal consciousness period, whereas weak illusionists deny that phenomenal consciousness has certain properties that it is commonly thought to have. I think Keith is a weak illusionist. No, okay, right. So this kind of illusionism is, with phenomenal consciousness as a theoretical construct, is a kind of weak illusionism, I think. And so really the task here, there's no hard problem on this view. And the task is really to explain why, philosophers tend to latch onto this notion and have all these problem intuitions. Okay, so as I said, experimental philosophers don't make this explicit, but their writing seem to suggest this view. So we've already seen this quote from Sitzman and Mashri, where they question the existence of experiences which are defined non-functionally. So experiences, this notion of experience which isn't exhausted by its functional role. And later on in the paper, they say that phenomenal consciousness only comes to seem obvious with philosophical training. Okay. Right, so 4 implications, those were on your handout. So moving on to so on the face of it, existing empirical XY literature seems to be quite problematic for certain, dominant way of theorizing about the heart problem. And so should some armchair philosophers in mind be worried? So now moving on to the bulk of this talk, and so I'm going to give a critique. So I'm going to raise 2 objections with respect to the experimental literature on the heart problem. So one is the objection from polysemy, and the second objection is the objection from ad hoc concepts. So these are linguistically motivated objections. So I'm coming from the perspective of a philosopher, language person, and a linguist. So I should really say that these objections don't exhaust all the concerns and the worries one might have with respect to all these different studies. But I think these objections they're general objections, and they apply to some of at least a lot of the studies. Okay. Right, so these objections problematize these 2 inferences. I'm going to repeat them. One is so these inferences are drawn from empirical data. The first inference is that lay people do not have philosophers' concept of phenomenal consciousness, and the second inference is that lay people do not have the relevant problem intuition. Okay, right. So I'm going to start with objection of polysemy. So this is again on your handout. So I'm going to put the objection in a argument form. So 2 premises and a conclusion. First premise, experimental data on lay people's judgments are used to draw conclusions 1 and 2, right? Premise 2, some experimental questions contain polysemous words, and it's not clear that participants have homed in on the relevant sense of the words in answering these questions. Conclusion, drawing conclusions 1 and 2 on the basis of empirical data collected from participants' responses to experimental questions of the kind in P2 is unjustified. So the argument is on your handout. So what I'll do is I'll explain what polysemy is, and then I'm going to look at some examples from these empirical studies. Okay. So polysemy, so I work on polysemy, and polysemy, it refers to a linguistic phenomenon where a word has multiple related meanings or senses. Okay, And according to one estimation, 40% of English words are polysemous. I think the real number, sometimes you get number like 80%. So it's a really widespread phenomenon. So polysemy is contrasted with homonymy. So a homonym is where a word has multiple distinct meanings, but the meanings are intuitively unrelated. So examples include bank and bat. Now, contexts usually make it clear, usually, but not always, which sense of the word or which meaning of the word is at issue. So suppose I say John had chicken for lunch, right? So chicken is ambiguous in English. Chicken is ambiguous between a meat sense and animal sense, right? So if I say John had chicken for lunch, given lunch is that issue, so the food is that issue. So chicken is naturally understood as chicken as meat. Whereas if I say chicken's chirpy, right? When only animal can be chirpy and meat is not usually chirpy. So context makes it clear, which sense is being used. Okay, so I think it's quite important to distinguish different types of polysemy. So I'm going to talk about two types. Take an expression T, which has two senses, S1 and S2, within a language L. Okay, so T is a polysemous term. Okay, so T, when I say T is polysemous at the individual level, what I mean is that individual language users of L recognize and routinely use the two senses. So really, it's a sort of apply to all language speakers of L or competent language speakers of L. So chicken is an example like this. We all have these two senses routinely used and retrieved. But also some polysemous terms can be polysemous on a community level. What I mean is that one of the senses of the polysemous term is recognized and routinely used by a subgroup of language users. So really, for a special, this subgroup of language user L, there's this extra sense that's routinely used in conversations. I think, the word, the controversial example, but the word woman potentially is a polysemous term at a community level. So at least subgroups of English speakers use this term to refer to gender identification. Right, yes. Okay, so I think some philosophical terms are polysemous at the community level. Okay, so how might this objection apply to some of the studies, right? And so as we already saw from Sitzman and Mashri's study on whether people have the concept of phenomenal consciousness, there was this concern raised by a number of critics that the phrase see red is potentially ambiguous, right? And so when you ask this question, did Jimmy see red, Jimmy being the robot, majority of non-philosophers attributed seeing red to the robot, right? And the concern there is that there's at least a reading of seeing red, a non-phenomenal reading, which we can reasonably attribute to simple robots. But really, the ambiguity of the phrase stems from the polysemy of the verb see itself, right? So the words see, if you just look up a dictionary, the dominant sense means something like to perceive with the eyes, right? So this applies to humans and animals. But there's also a sort of subordinate sense where see applies to simple equipment like radar and cameras and the satellites. So this sense of see means something like to detect something by means of light or other electromagnetic waves. So when the question, think about the context, when a simple robot is at issue here, naturally the sense of see is easily invoked. So just because non-philosophers attribute see red in this sense to robot doesn't mean that they wouldn't recognize phenomenality, something in common between see red and the feel pain. Okay, so and also we saw that in a later revision of the experiment, see red and the feel pain were replaced with experience red and experience pain. Now, results were similar in that study, and I think the verb experience is also polysemous as well. So we can talk about non-sentient beings as experiencing difficulties, for example. So the company is experiencing difficulties, right? That's perfectly fine. And think about the phrase experience red. It's not really very natural. It's kind of artificial. So there's at least an interpretation of experience red, which can be understood as encountering the color of red. So I think this would explain why a significant portion of participants attribute experience read to the robots. Again, this doesn't mean that they fail to see phenomenality. Okay. Right. And also with respect to inference 2, so in Diaz's experiment on explanatory and metaphysical intuitions, he asked participants to rate these statements. The properties of pain are fully explained in terms of neuroactivity in the DPI. The feeling of pain is just a neuroactivity in the DPI. And I think words like explain and is are plausibly polysemous. Okay, so think about the word explain. So there's this general sense that all English speakers, competent English speakers have, where explain is means something like make intelligible. And so this is kind of under specified sense of explain. But of course, you know, philosophers distinguish different kinds of explanation. There's reductive explanation, there's causal explanation, right? So the properties of pain are fully causally explained in terms of neuroactivity in the DPI. Even dualists would agree to that. But it's far from clear that everyone would agree that the properties of pain are fully reductively explained in terms of neuroactivity in the DPI. Okay, so now if you just have this kind of general under specific sense of explain, that doesn't mean that you would lack the explanatory intuition, because what is really at issue is a reductive explanation. I'm going to assume people know the difference, but I'm happy to clarify in Q&A. So really the word explain is potentially a polysemous term at the community level. So philosophers who engage in this debate, when they talk about explanation, whether physical processes fully explain consciousness, they obviously directly retrieve this reductive sense of explanation. Okay, and it's sort of well known that the copula is ambiguous between an identity sense and the predication sense. So on the predication sense, we can say something like John is the embodiment of conservatism, which means something like John has features that define conservatism. Okay, now looking at the red statement, now it's a bit hard to hear the predication is, but I think it's not impossible. So on the predication is the feeling of pain is just neuroactivity in the DPI means something like the feeling of pain has neural features, certain neural features, namely being activated in the DPI. Okay, again, what is really at issue is the identity is with respect to intuition about dualism and physicalism. But you know, without making sure that participants have latched on to the intended sense of it is, you know, you can't really just directly draw the conclusion from their judgments that whether they lack dualistic intuition or not. Okay, so that's the objection from polysemy, and then I'm going to move on to the objection from ad hoc concepts. So I'm going to spend more time on this. So here is how the objection goes. Again, on your handout, 2 premises. The experimental data on lay people's judgments are used to draw conclusion 2. So here's conclusion 2. So this objection really applies to the second inference. P2, some philosophical concepts find their origins as ad hoc concepts, and it is not clear that participants in experimental contexts have successfully latched onto the relevant ad hoc concepts in making judgments concerning these concepts. So it's really in a similar form as the first objection. Conclusion, drawing conclusion 2 on the basis of empirical data collected from participants' judgments of the kind in P2 is unjustified. Again, a linguistically motivated objection. So what I'll do is I'll explain what ad hoc concepts are, and then I'm gonna illustrate that philosophers' what is like concepts are ad hoc concepts, and then I'm gonna look at some key studies, how this objection apply to some of the studies. Okay. So ad hoc concepts. So this is a notion that features prominently in lexical pragmatics, especially in relevance theory, which is a post-Gricean inferential approach to pragmatics. So very basically, so the idea is that a speaker, so imagine a conversation, a speaker can use a word or phrase to communicate an ad hoc concept that is different from the lexically encoded concept. And the hearer can construct the intended ad hoc concept pragmatically in utterance comprehension. So I'm going to give an example to illustrate the notion. Okay, so consider the scenario. Ben belongs to a drama group organized by Linda. Ben has been behaving unreasonably and aggressively towards others since he joined the group a month ago. He always demands to play the lead role and frequently ridicules others' acting skills. Okay, Linda, the group leader, having talked to Ben about his behavior multiple times, tells another group member, Juan, so we've got 3 people, and the utterance is between Linda and Juan. Okay, what she says is, either Ben becomes a human being or he leaves the group. Okay, so we all understand this utterance, right? So Linda doesn't mean literally that Ben has to be a human being, because Ben is a human being, right? What she meant is something like Ben has to be a reasonable or polite human being, otherwise he'll have to leave the group. So in this case, in this context, Linda uses a lexicalized concept human being to convey a non-lexicalized ad hoc concept human being star, where human being star is roughly something like polite and reasonable human beings, right? Okay, so this is a case of semantic narrowing. So the denotations being picked out by the ad hoc concept being stars form a subset, are narrower than the extensions being picked out with the lexicalized concept human being. Okay, and similar example, this is toxic speech. He's more of a man than you will ever be, so it's really specific kind of man, right? And now you can also get the opposite effect as well. You can get semantic broadening as well, with extensions being picked out by the ad hoc concept are broader than the extensions being picked out by the lexicalized concept. So hyperbola will be an example of this. Okay, so I mean, I'm getting to this. I'm gonna get to what is like concepts, and then but bear with me. Okay, so right now, addressee. So think about Juan. Juan is being told, by Linda, Linda utters this utterance to Juan. So Juan can construct an intended ad hoc concept, a human being star, and intended meaning of Linda's utterance through the process of pragmatic inference. In particular, he can rely on his encyclopedic knowledge to do with human beings, right? In this particular context, let's assume that Juan knows about Ben's behavior, right? And in this context, Juan, the encyclopedic knowledge to do with human beings being usually polite and reasonable around others is likely to receive high activation and thus be easily accessible. Okay, and so in this context, Ben can infer from Linda's utterance that draw this contextual implication that Linda wants Ben to be polite and a reasonable person, or Ben will have to leave the group. But this contextual implications is only derivable from Linda's utterance if the lexicalized concept human being is adjusted to the ad hoc concept human being stuff. So, for relevance theorists, ad hoc concepts feature as part of the truth conditional content of speaker's utterance. So really, human being start is part of the truth condition. Okay, right. So I should just say something about the difference between ad hoc concepts and the concepts encoded by a polysemous term. Okay, so the concepts encoded by a polysemous term are stored in long-term memory and are lexicalized, so we just retrieve them directly. Whereas ad hoc concepts are not stored or lexicalized, they're constructed on the fly in the particular context of utterance comprehension. But ad hoc concepts provide the foundation for polysemy. So once the ad hoc concept is routinely used and lexicalized, then the term becomes polysemous. Okay, so examples include words like saint and evangelist. Right, so ad hoc concepts are common features. They're believed to be common features of ordinary discourse, and some philosophical concepts also find their origins as ad hoc concepts. And so I'm going to illustrate with philosophers, so relevant to this discussion, philosophers of what is like concepts. So I'm going to call them what is like P concepts, and they're actually, I think they're different from the what is like concepts which are encoded by ordinary discourse. Now, there are different what is like P concepts. There's the concept of what is like to be a bat from the inside in Nagel's case. There's the concept of what is like to see red in Jackson's case. So there are different instances of what is like P concepts, and they all fall under the general concept of phenomenal consciousness. Okay. Now, philosophers, obviously, I should say that they routinely use what is like locution to introduce the notion of phenomenal consciousness or phenomenal character. Okay. But what is like locution is commonly used in ordinary discourse. It's completely non-technical. So let me give you some examples. John knows what it's like to live in the forest. But prime minister has no idea what it's like to be poor. Zara tells her grandchildren what it was like when the war ended. What will it be like this winter when gas bills increase again? So you can embed what is like locution in different kinds of constructions. And the philosophers of mind tend to focus on this infinitive construction, what is like to phi, where phi is supposed to refer to a phenomenal state, something like seeing something red. Okay. Now there are different accounts for the semantics of what is likeness in the philosophical literature. So I'm going to talk about an account that I like very much, and this is Daniel Stodge's affective account. So this is a simplified version of his account. So on his account, take this locution S knows what is like to phi. So he thinks that this locution is true in context C if and only if there is in C some way W such that S knows that phi-ing the event affects one in way W. So this is on your handout. So way W is understood as a thing having property. Okay, and so his account, on his account, what is like locution picks out an affective relation between a subject, right, between S and the event of phi-ing. Okay, right. So he also talks. So take the locution, John knows what it's like to live in the forest. On the affective account, this utterance is true in a context C, if and only if there is in C some way W, such that S knows that phi-ing affects one in W. So this could be a positive way or negative way. Now, Stodge also points out that in the stereotypical context, what is like locution picks out an experiential way. Okay, sometimes it doesn't pick out experiential way. So when we say something like Brexiteers had no idea what it would be like for the UK to leave the EU, right? That's non-experiential way being picked out. But Stodge points out that in stereotypical context, we use this locution to refer to an experiential way. So if a subject is affected by an experiential way, by an event, and the subject feels a certain way, where feel is understood in a very broad sense. Okay, now moving on to, so that's just ordinary what is like locution. Moving on to philosophers, what is like locutions, what is like P locutions. So consider this statement about Mary, Jackson's Mary. Mary knows what it's like to see red, right? If we just apply the affective account, what it says is Mary knows what it's like to see red is true in context C, if and only if there is in C some way W, such that Mary knows that seeing red affects one in way W, right? Now, put in this way W could be all sorts of different kinds of ways, right? It could be a neurological way, right? So Mary, obviously, when she sees red for the first time, there's neurological reactions in her brain. And way W could be an idiosyncratic way. Maybe when she sees red for the first time, all of a sudden she has revolutionary thoughts about politics, right? But philosophers, in philosophers of mind, are only interested in a particular kind of way. They're not interested in, especially in that context, they're not interested in these ways. They're interested in a certain kind of experiential way, so appealing to the stereotypical uses of what is like talk. But they're not just interested in any experiential way. They're interested in an experiential way that is constitutive and essential to this phenomenal state of seeing red. So the way they're particularly interested in, philosophers of mind interested in, is this experiential way that is constitutive of the phenomenal state of seeing red. That's the way Mary learns when she sees red for the first time. Okay, so let's call this phenomenal way. Okay, now philosophers of what is like P concepts are distinct from the ordinary what is like P concepts encoded by ordinary locution. And I think this is a case of semantic narrowing. So think about the affective the analysis on the affective account, which just says what is like locution picks out a particular way, right? Doesn't have to be a specific way. It could be experiential or non-experiential. Whereas the philosopher is interested in this very narrow kind of way, which is experiential and essential to the state, to this particular kind of phenomenal state. So it's a case of narrowing with the extension, the denotations are narrow than the denotations being picked out by the lexically encoded concept. Okay, so I should say that philosophers, when they use what is like locution, they often assume that the addressees understand what this locution is supposed to pick out, which can be very unhelpful when the addressee is non-philosopher. But at least in some introductory texts or some classical texts on consciousness, philosophers sometimes make it very clear how one is supposed to understand what is light locution. So think about Nagel's paper, 1974 paper. So he really popularized this locution, what is light locution. So he says subjective experiences have this what is light character, but immediately after he says this, he says that what is light character of subjective experience is not to be analyzed in functional or behavioral terms. So on the affective account, he immediately rules out non-experiential ways where a subject can be affected by the event, say by being a bat, right? So in the bat case, it rules out non-experiential ways such as hanging out in the cave, hunting for insects. That's not the way he's interested in. But then he goes on to talk about bat's experience from the inside, from the subjective point of view. So to help his addressee to latch on to the intended notion of what is light talk. And I think Jackson's Mary case sets up really nice context. There's a really clear contrast between Mary's release and then after release. So what is really at question is about Mary's experience, this experiential way. And so I think it makes easier for the addressee to latch on to the intended notion of what is light talk. Okay, so but often, as I said, philosophers don't make it clear how one is supposed to understand what is locution, and this can be very confusing if you're not familiar with this kind of locution in the philosophical discourse. And indeed, I think when we talk about ad hoc concepts in ordinary conversations, an addressee can fail to latch on to an intended ad hoc concepts. So going on to the experimental philosopher critique. An addressee can fail to latch on to an ad hoc concept in all sorts of different ways. So for instance, the addressee can be confused, the speaker might not be particularly clear, and there might be a lack of a contextual information. So think about this conversation, this utterance from Linda to Juan. Suppose that Juan has no idea that Ben has been behaving badly, right? Suppose Juan is a new member. Well, in that context, it would be a bit hard for Ben to latch on to the ad hoc concept human beings style, which means something like polite and reasonable human beings, right? So a lack of contextual information would impede the addressee from latching on to the intended ad hoc concept. And also, ordinary conversations are endowed with the conversational feedback mechanisms between the speaker and the addressee. So there's lots of back and forth. If the addressee is confused, they can ask the speaker for clarification. But sometimes, some conversational settings lack this kind of feedback mechanism. So say, for instance, experimental settings, or say writing emails or letters, you can't really ask your speaker to clarify. So all these conditions can prevent the addressee from latching on to the intended meaning of the speaker's utterance and the intended ad hoc concept. Now, given this worry, so the objection on ad hoc concepts is this: some philosophically interesting concepts find their origins as ad hoc concepts. So addressees can fail to construct an ad hoc concept in unfavorable conversation settings. So in using experimental questions concerning such a philosophical concept, experimentals ought to make sure that participants have successfully latched onto the relevant concept, but this is not always the case. So just take some examples. So in Tobias's study, where he asked people's explanatory intuitions, so one of the statements he uses is this: neural activity in the DPI cannot explain what it's like to feel pain. So as I just said, there are all sorts of different ways to understand what is light locution. It could be neurological way, right? So, participants could just latch on to whatever ad hoc concept they construct, right? Without making sure that they have latched on to the intended what is light locution, drawing inferences from their judgments about whether they have explanatory intuition seems to be quite problematic. And I should also say, similar concern with respect to the notion of explain. So the notion of explain, reductive explain, where the explanatory resources only come from the bottom level. That notion of explanation is really what's relevant here, and that's potentially it's a concept that has origin as an ad hoc concept as well. Another example where Parasini asks these participants whether these scenarios are possible. So logical possibility. So really what's at issue is logical possibility, right? And that's a notion possibility that has origin as ad hoc concept. So imagine how you would teach your students about the notion of logical possibility. You would say something like, oh, it's a possibility in the broadest sense or something like that. You'll set up a context to make sure that your addressee latch onto the intended sense of possibility. Right, so really the concern here is that ad hoc concepts, sometimes the meaning of a term is determined by contextual factors, and ad hoc concepts are common features of ordinary discourse, and some philosophical concepts are like that as well. Okay, so without making sure that participants have latched on to the intended concept, we shouldn't be drawing conclusions like two, drawing inferences like two is very problematic. Okay, so now I'll just conclude the talk. So basically, experimental philosophers tend to draw inferences 1 and 2 from their experimental data, and 1 and 2 then get used to draw further philosophical implications. So we saw 4 implications. So insofar as the inferences 1 and 2 are problematic, these further implications look a bit problematic as well. I should just make 2 notes. So with respect to the heart problem itself, I should note that the heart problem can be motivated without relying on the general concept of phenomenal consciousness. It can be easily motivated by relying on philosophers of what is like P concept. So the question is really about whether whether lay people have, whether lay people can latch onto this concept and have relevant, intuition, anti-physicalist intuition. At least existing data don't suggest that lay people are unable to latch onto this concept. And then this another issue with respect to obviousness. So one has been used to cast doubt on this claim that existence of phenomenal consciousness seems obvious. And the reasoning behind this idea is that if the existence of a phenomenon seems obvious, then we would expect people to track this phenomenon and have the relevant concept. So do lay people have the concept of phenomenal consciousness? I think maybe they do, but one possibility is that lay people indeed have the concept of phenomenal consciousness, but lack a word in English that uniquely encodes the concept. So maybe the word conscious is a potentially polysemous term, where one of the stable senses is this kind of phenomenal consciousness sense. So when we say, is he conscious? When a doctor asks this question, maybe conscious refers to phenomenal consciousness. Another possibility is just to reject this conditional. Maybe a phenomenon can seem obvious without language speakers having a concept that track this phenomenon. Okay, right. So I'll end with 2 further points with respect to X5 in general. So one is that philosophers routinely use a term or phrase in a specific sense, and as philosophers, we sometimes are oblivious to the fact that the relevant philosophical sense is distinct from the encoded sense of a term or phrase as used in ordinary language. I think this happens with what is like talk. And so that, experimental philosophers are obviously oblivious to this fact, given my objections. So it's important to be reminded of this. And this second general point is that the 2 objections are raised, the objection from polysemy and the objection from ad hoc concepts. These are general objections that apply to experimental X5 in general. So the concern here is that it's not always clear that in a particular experimental setting, participants have latched onto the relevant concepts. So polysemy and ad hoc concepts are really widespread phenomenon. So given how widespread they are, experimental philosophers ought to make sure that participants have latched onto the relevant concepts. And there are different ways to do this, by using explicit explanations or using pre-testing or post-testing to make sure that participants have latched onto an intended sense. So this is by no means, I'm not raising a challenge, with respect to the usefulness of experimental philosophy, but it's really a challenge that calls for careful experimental design. Okay, thank you.